We're going to turn now to our next guest, Chris Gunness. The United States and allied governments have frozen funding to UNRWA, the UN agency that provides basic health and education services to millions of Palestinian refugees. Right now, UNRWA is a lifeline for Palestinians facing Israel's genocide in Gaza. The pretext for the funding freeze is Israel's claim, which cannot be independently verified, that 12 out of the thousands of UNRWA employees in Gaza took part in the October 7th resistance operation. The UN has fired a number of them without due process and without any credible investigations being completed. We all know how much Israel has lied during this genocide, so we can't take any of their accusations at face value, especially when we have not heard from those Israel is accusing. But this does appear to be part of Israel's long-running effort to destroy UNRWA. And we want to welcome our guest, Chris Gunness. Chris is a former spokesperson for UNRWA. We've had him, the last time we had you on the program, Chris, was during the very delicate week-long ceasefire truce back in November, and so much has happened since then. It's really good to see you, and thank you so much for coming back on the Electronic Intifada.
Thank you, Nora. Thank you, Ali. Lovely to see you again.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you for coming back. Now, Chris, more than 150 UNRWA workers have been killed during this Israeli genocide in Gaza, and that's the largest number of UN personnel killed in any conflict situation in the history of the United Nations. And according to the most recent figures from UNRWA, more than 145 of its facilities in Gaza have been damaged. How can we explain that none of that has prompted either the United States or its allies to curtail their military, political, economic, and diplomatic support for the perpetrator, Israel? Doesn't that simply reveal that whatever Israel is claiming those workers did is just a pretext for an attack on UNRWA as an organization?
Ali, this is very consistent with a repeated pattern of political attacks on UNRWA. And by the way, it always spikes when there's an upturn in the fighting or the violence, call it what you will, a genocide in Gaza. It always goes up. So always when, Israel attacks attacks Gaza, and there are, bombs going off in schools, immediately the whole machinery kicks in, rather as it has done this time, and you get these accusations. So these accusations are part of a pattern, number one. It's also part of a political, it's not even, it's not even a sort of thinly disguised conspiracy. I mean, go on Google, look at the document that was released, I believe, on the 26th of December, where the Israelis sort of let out, or it was leaked, I don't know how it got into the public domain, but it was authenticated, a three-point plan. One is a smear campaign against UNRWA. The second phase was a defund campaign against UNRWA. And the third was a dismantle, destroy phase of UNRWA. And I think what we're seeing now is certainly part two, the defund UNRWA, sort of morphing into part three, which is destroy UNRWA. So yes, it's part of a political attack. And what's so sad, I mean, what's really sad this time, and by the way, the figure has gone up, the number of donors, I've got it in front of me, it's now 16. Australia, Austria, Canada, Estonia, Finland, Germany, Italy, Iceland, Japan, Latvia, Lithuania, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Romania, UK, and US. It's now gone up. Those people have really stabbed the agency in the back. It's an absolute betrayal. UNRWA, as you said, Nora, in your introduction, they dismiss these people even before the investigation, which is being done by the Office of Internal Oversight in New York, had barely begun. I mean, and what more do the donors want? And this is why I come to this conspiracy. This is what this campaign to destroy UNRWA. If the donors really wanted to restore aid, they would have said to UNRWA, don't you think, well, here's what you've got to do in order to get funding restored, X, Y, and Z. UNRWA hasn't been told that. I was talking to UNRWA colleagues earlier today, and I said, have they told you what you've got to do? And they said, no. I said, I think that's sort of poor donorship, a bit odd. And the other thing, of course, is none of them, if you ask them, you say, what are you trying to achieve by this suspension of aid? They can't tell you. I mean, what more proof do you...
So why are they doing it?
Right. Right.
Why
Well,
are
I
they
think
doing
there
it?
really is. I mean, I think that this utterly absurd far-right Israeli fascistic dream that you can somehow get rid of Palestine refugees if you get rid of the agency that's providing services to them. I think they actually believe that. I mean, that's a bit like saying that if you got rid of Oxfam, you get rid of poor people. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. Or saying, a nurse in the National Health Service in Britain has murdered some babies. Let's just cut off funding to the NHS. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. And by the way, I mean, bad things happen in UN agencies, sadly, all around the world. You had child abuse scandals in UN peacekeeping. I mean, murders, crimes, terrible things. But the donors don't turn around and say, well, we'll cut off aid entirely. It's only when Israel decides that it's going to have this crazy campaign. And the donors panicked. I mean, let's be clear here. The donors panicked. And I honestly, I think, Philippe Lazzarini, God bless him, I think he's doing, under incredible...
And he is the Commissioner General, the head of UNRWA,
yeah, a man I know well. I really like the guy. But once as I say, I think some of his public advocacy has been superb. And I think he's doing a good job under appalling pressure. But once he basically sacked these people, Israel could turn around and say, well, there you go, they're guilty. But actually, I don't think the evidence they've produced, and I haven't seen it, but from what I understand, it's not been properly assessed yet. But there's such a long history of lies, misinformation. I mean, I remember the 2014 conflict, just to name but one. Every time they hit an UNRWA school, they put out this thing. Mark Regev would phone up a journalist. The journalist would phone me up and say, Mark Regev just told us that, there are militants firing rockets out of the schools. Of course, in the fog of war, we couldn't send staff in immediately to investigate because there were explosions going on. Staff's lives were in danger. But when it was all over and we started to investigate, it turned out to be absolute nonsense. The vast majority of these accusations that are made turn out to be utter nonsense. And so, you make what philosophers call inductive generalizations, and you say, well, it's very likely that this is possibly also nonsense. And Ali, would you allow me to make just one very quick point? This organization, Impact SE, they are the ones who sat in Congress. Marcus Shepp, who's the guy who's in charge of them, making all these accusations against UNRWA. Now, talking of a lack of authority, just in 2022, I believe it was, the UNRWA Commissioner General responded to one of these attacks they'd made on UNRWA textbooks. And when UNRWA started to investigate the texts which we were being attacked over, it turned out UNRWA didn't even use those books. I mean, why does the world give credence and credibility, put them in a hearing in Capitol Hill and have them saying these extraordinary things about UNRWA's education when it has a proven track record in either making things up or getting things wrong? Look on UNRWA's website and have a look at the press release that was put out. It's crystal clear. I mean, no, this is mad. And UNRWA has got systems in place better than anybody else. And this is, if you'll allow me to address this, Nora and Ali, there's all this talk. We heard it on Capitol Hill yesterday. Let's replace UNRWA. Well, let me tell you, UNRWA has 13,000 staff in Gaza alone. It's got nearer 33 in the rest of the region, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and the West Bank, and then Gaza. If you wanted to get 13,000 people, and they're all doing a job, right? So if you want to replace UNRWA to do its present job, you'd have to recruit 13,000 people. If you want to cut its mandate down, which only the General Assembly can do, not just Israel, you could say make it 6,000. But let's stick with a figure of 13,000. You'd have to put adverts in websites or newspapers or somewhere to recruit 13,000 people. You'd then have to get the personnel department to go through all the applications, have the first interview, whittle them down, do the second interview. Then you'd make your choice of your candidates. Then you've got to do the onboarding process.
And you've got to do that and you've got to do all that during a genocide. Yeah.
But when people are starving. Yeah.
Yeah. But
and why people starving. And then what you do is you onboard them, you do all the security checks. People who've got this idea that you can replace UNRWA overnight and bring in UNHCR. And by the way, UNRWA are the cheapest workers in frankly, the entire UN system. So the donors who have not thought through the practicalities, and I think it's beginning to dawn on them, and the Israeli generals, by the way, who think, oh my God, we're the occupying power. if we get rid of UNRWA, we might have to start doing food distributions.
But Chris, there's so much there to unpack, and I just want to put a couple of points out there because that there was a lot that you addressed. First of all, this Israeli pattern of throwing out accusations and then the donors jump. This is not new. We saw this.
Sorry, finish, Ali. Finish.
Yeah.
Shall I go?
Well, I just want to put a few things to you.
Yeah.
So they did this back in, I think it was October 2021, with the major Palestinian human rights groups like 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐿, Defense for Children International, and all the European donors cut off their funds. And they said, oh, we take the Israeli allegations about ties to terrorism very, very seriously, and we're going to investigate, and we're going to freeze our funding. And then, of course, there is a long investigation. Then, of course, it comes out in the end that the Israeli allegations are completely baseless. But by that time, the damage has been done to the reputations of those organizations and to their functioning and to their funding and so on. That's something that our colleague Maureen writes about in her piece that Nora referred to earlier. We can flash that up on the screen so people can find it. And they also did this with World Vision, the major international charity that works in Gaza, where Israel arrested its Gaza director, Mohammed al-Halabi. He's still in prison, made these ridiculous accusations that he had funneled $40–50 million from World Vision's funding to Hamas, something World Vision said was impossible because
they don't have that budget.
Our entire program in Gaza was something like $2 million, and World Vision, which is based in the US, and it was the Australian branch, the Australian government, not a great friend of the Palestinians, investigated. World Vision investigated, they hired their own independent auditors, and they all found it was baseless. So this is a playbook that Israel does repeatedly. But the Ali, point you make, go ahead, Chris.
No, well, I was going to say, I mean, there is something that feels slightly different, and that is that UNRWA's not in certain time I've been, involved in UNRWA. We've never had a situation where the top donors have simply defunded over something like this. I mean, it's so disproportionate, and it is unprecedented. I mean, they've never just, we're talking about $500 million they've taken with them, which is going to affect UNRWA programs.
What will be the impact of that, Chris? Talk about what will be the impact.
Okay, so UNRWA's budget has two tranches. There's the core budget, which is education, health, relief, and social services, which is the vast majority of the budget. And the biggest part of that, more than half, is educating way over 500,000 children across the Middle East. So that's under threat. And why any government that's worried about regional stability in the Middle East thinks that defunding human development programs that bring a sense of calm and stability in some of the most marginalized, disadvantaged, fragile communities in the Middle East, that somehow contributes to regional stability, I find that quite hard to get my mind around. But of course, the other part is the emergency assistance. So UNRWA, through its history, has done schools and health, and off it goes. And then suddenly a war or a genocide or something will break out around them, and they have to drop everything, employ new people, use up the emergency budget, go after funds and do this. And that's sort of what's really at stake here. The aid pipeline is quite fragile. There are in-kind donations, but basically, if you want to procure food, unless you get it in kind, you've got to buy it, and that needs having money. And if you don't have that money, you can't buy food, you can't buy medicine, you can't buy, sanitary products for the women, you can't buy vaccines for the newborn babies. So, that's my biggest concern. It's these emergency services, which the people coming into the health centers and the food distribution centers, but the school term should have started. Kids should be at school. But it's not just the kids in Gaza. Donors concerned about regional health, about regional stability. It's the schools in Nahr al-Bared. It's the schools in Sabra, Shatila, in the south, in Sidon and Tyre. It's the schools in Yarmouk. It's the schools in Homs. It's the schools in Marka camp in Jordan. Some of the worst camps in the Middle East. You're going to start finding kids on the streets of these places. Guess what? Pretty, well educated but underemployed people do. I mean, I don't want to buy into this stereotype that all Palestinians are terrorists, but you you are going to start having hungry, angry people. And why anyone thinks having large populations of hungry, angry people on the doorstep of Israel, even if we for a moment buy into the security narrative of Israel as a reason for supporting UNRWA, which of course, I don't. I think there are human development reasons for and human rights reasons for supporting UNRWA. But even if you buy into that, it's just not in Israel's interest to have all these, people in a desperate situation, having seen their relatives being slaughtered on the doorstep of Israel. They're creating another huge Palestinian refugee population. And I wanted to come back to something you asked earlier, Ali and Nora, if you'll give me time. This idea that somehow on the step towards ethnically cleansing and forcing these people into the Sinai, which, by the way, is very clearly in the leaked document of the 13th of October, the security document. It was where they presented 3 options, and the preferred option, time and time again endorsed, was kick all these refugees out, kick all even the non-refugees. So Gaza, 2/3 refugees, 1/3 not, but kick them all out into Sinai. That's apparently one of the plans. Now, in order to do that, it's going to be quite useful to get rid of UNRWA, because UNRWA doesn't have a mandate to operate, only has a mandate to operate in these 5 areas: Gaza, West Bank, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon. You'd have to bring in UNHCR if you really wanted to do that. But I can tell you, my old boss, Filippo Grandi, I think he'd have a total nosebleed if he starts contemplating the idea of setting up tented cities for Palestinians in Sinai. And apart from anything else, there's Egypt's sovereignty, the small issue of Egypt's sovereignty, let alone poverty levels there. So the idea that Egypt would take all this on and that UNHCR would gladly step in to fulfill the role of UNRWA, it's all far right cuckoo land stuff. Yeah. And I think they're going to come to their sense. I think the donors are already coming to their senses and thinking, what have we bought into? I think the penny's beginning to drop. But they've betrayed UNRWA. They've betrayed the refugees. And the other point, if you won't mind, if I make, is that where are the Arabs? Now, I know that the Arabs say, well, Israel blows up Gaza every 3 or 4 years and we always rebuild it and, blah, blah. And I totally understand that, right? Israel is allowed off the leash. America supplies the arms. They blow it up. But this the narrative which is the classic Arab narrative with UNRWA, which is the Germans did the Holocaust, drove the Jews into, the Jews fled to Palestine. The Palestinians were displaced, and therefore it's a European-American problem to sort out the impact of the displacement of Palestinians. I mean, that is all true. And coupled with the fact that Israel blows up Gaza every few years, you can see why Arab states don't want to pay for it. Having said that, that narrative is getting a bit tired and is a bit out of date, because here you've got Gaza being the cause, to some degree, the casus belli of a widening war in the Middle East. So, the Houthis, for example, will say, well, we're attacking Western shipping interests because look at what the West is doing to Gaza. So, I was looking at some figures for OPEC oil profits, and the latest figures are from 2022. And in 2022, OPEC made $888 billion profit. UNRWA's entire budget is 1.5 billion. That is 0.02% of all of OPEC's oil revenues. So, with 10 seconds of oil revenue, OPEC in a heartbeat could solve UNRWA's financial problems. And the important political point here is that would take away the political leverage which Israel has and uses, as we've seen in this lamentable recent episode. It takes away the leverage that Israel has over the Western governments, the Western donors, which it's exerting on UNRWA and the refugees for political purposes. Because if it were the case that the donor base had been diversified and more Arab states had been brought in more generously, UNRWA would simply go to the Arabs and say, listen, look what Israelis are doing. We're going to need a bit more cash for this year, but hopefully that shouldn't take the pressure off the Western donors. And as I say, they're slowly seeing that they've been hoodwinked by this Israeli, plot. So I'm not saying
sadly, Chris, in the context of the so-called Abraham Accords, the normalization deals between various Arab regimes, Gulf regimes, and Israel, the United Arab Emirates actually slashed its contribution to UNRWA. So they've actually been moving in the wrong direction. Not uniformly, but certainly some of the richest states who have that wherewithal, which unfortunately they are also under UNRWA's or sort of under Israel's influence.
One quick thing I wanted to say earlier, and I'll regret not having said it when we put the phone down. We've talked about these investigations as a pretext for cutting off aid. What about the idea that if Israeli soldiers are found to have committed war crimes, then Western governments like the Americans and the Brits cut off their support for Israel? I mean, wouldn't that seem logical?
Or freeze it at least.
Right.
Freeze it.
Yes, suspend it until they have
pending an investigation.
Pending an investigation. Maybe Israel would sack them in advance of the investigation.
That's
Who knows?
Right. Chris, we just have a few minutes left, but over the last few days, lots of people have been sharing the link to UNRWA's donation page and making donations as individuals or as families in support of the organization's work. Does this make a difference?
It does. I mean, let's face it, UNRWA's budget is 1.5 billion.
Right.
One of the differences it makes is it forms a link, a bond between a child or a grandmother or someone, and there's an empathy, which I think is really, really important. And I think that is the key value of these smaller donations. But somebody in Milwaukee giving $10 is really not going to touch the side. Frankly, I don't want to discourage anyone doing it. And I think that donations, with the stuff that goes around donations, schools having fundraisers in which they educate their students about the plight of children in Gaza in their schools. I think that's all extremely valuable. But basically, nothing should be done to take the pressure off. Not that it's very much pressure, but nothing should be done to take the pressure off the Western donors. What they're doing is an utter betrayal. Just as these staff members, if indeed it turns out they've done what they've done, a lot of my colleagues in Gaza, they also, I have to be honest and say, feel betrayed, because they've been trying to uphold the values and the standards of neutrality in the most, the darkest days. And they feel that these people have been irresponsible. They're getting, UNRWA's support being slashed. It's going to affect more than 30,000 colleagues potentially. So, they feel that they want to, for them, this is their finest hour. This is the biggest political and financial crisis in UNRWA's history, sad to say. And the staff I know in Gaza really want to prove themselves and show that they are humanitarians. As Ali said, 152 have made the ultimate sacrifice in the service of humanity, and they want to carry on doing it. They feel betrayed, but they feel betrayed most of all by the donors, which is why I say, and I've been saying it time and time again, the donors need to come back, and they need to come back soon. It's disproportionate, it's punitive. Frankly, it's immoral, it's a disgrace, and they need to show some good donorship. They need to come back immediately, and I think that Arab states need to come in and really up their game. Their oil revenues are massive, and as I say, OPEC could give 0.02 of its oil profits very, very quickly.
Or if donor states really wanted to get rid of UNRWA, and Israel really wanted to get rid of UNRWA, they could implement the Palestinian right of return and its legal obligations under international law.
That's the best point of all. The very best way to get rid of UNRWA is in the context of some kind of peace deal, which sees the refugees have their full rights, including the right to self-determination. Bring it on. Let's get rid of UNRWA, but let's get rid of it according to international law.
Absolutely. Chris Gunness, it's always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for being here and for all your valuable insight and analysis. As always, you are the former spokesperson for UNRWA, and we will have you back on as soon as we can. Thanks, Chris.
Goody. It's a pleasure. It's lovely to be with you both and your audience, and I hope you're all well in the darkest of hours. But take heart, this is going to change. It's really going to change. I mean, the UNRWA crisis is really going to change. And I pray, in my heart of hearts, that the penny is dropping, that the only way out of this to protect Israelis is by giving the Palestinians their full rights as individuals and all of their collective rights.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, leave a comment, These engagements help us with the YouTube algorithm, and it helps us to get around Silicon Valley censorship as much as possible. It does make a difference. You can also support our journalism by going to electronicintifada.net and clicking on donate now. Thank you.